The gunmetal sky over Larkspur Hollow had not let up in 3 days, and Eleanor Voss stood at the edge of her dying pasture with a rifle in her hands and a stranger's wagon rattling toward her gate, not knowing that the next 60 seconds would decide whether her family survived the winter at all. She had buried her husband, Thomas, only 4 months earlier, in the frozen ground behind the barn, and since that day she had learned to read danger in the sound of wheels on a road. Every man who came up that lane either wanted to buy her land for pennies or wanted something worse. So when the wagon slowed and a broad-shouldered man in a threadbare coat climbed down, holding the hands of 2 small children who were shivering so hard their teeth clattered, Eleanor raised the rifle without a second thought and told him to state his business or turn around. If this story moves something in you, if you believe broken people can still choose kindness and that second chances are worth fighting for, take a moment right now to like this video, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to Golden Outlaw Tales, because this story is only just beginning, and where it goes will stay with you long after it ends. The man's name was Caleb Reed, and he did not raise his hands and surrender so much as he simply stood there, tired in a way that went deeper than the cold, and told her the truth plainly. His wife had died of fever on the trail 2 winters back, he said, and since then he had been drifting from town to town, taking whatever work a man with 2 young mouths to feed could find, and the work had dried up 3 towns ago. He nodded toward the 2 children huddled against the wagon wheel, a boy of about 7 and a girl no older than 4, both of them pale, both of them hollow-eyed with hunger. He said he had seen her milk cow grazing near the fence line from the road, and he was not too proud to admit that his children had not tasted milk in 11 days. He said if she would let his son and daughter drink from that cow just once, just enough to put color back in their cheeks, he would work her land until his hands bled, for as long as it took to earn it fair, and he would ask for nothing more than that. Eleanor did not lower the rifle right away. She had heard sweet words before, from men who turned cruel the moment a woman let her guard down, and grief had taught her that softness could get a person killed out here just as easily as a bullet could. But then the little girl coughed, a wet, rattling sound that no 4-year-old should ever make, and something in Eleanor's chest cracked open despite herself, because she remembered a version of that sound from her own son's crib, 3 winters before this one, and the fever that had almost taken him too. She lowered the rifle slowly, and she told Caleb Reed that his children could drink their fill, but that did not mean she trusted him, and it did not mean he was staying. He did not ask to stay that first night. He built a small fire near the tree line at the edge of her property, out past the barn, and he and his children slept wrapped in a single moth-eaten blanket while the temperature dropped below freezing. Eleanor watched from her kitchen window, telling herself it was none of her concern, that she had her own children to protect, her own son Daniel who was 9 and her own daughter Ruth who was 6, and that a stranger's suffering was not her burden to carry. But she did not sleep that night either, and somewhere around 3 in the morning, unable to bear the thought of 2 small children freezing within sight of her own warm hearth, she pulled on her coat, walked out into the biting wind, and told Caleb that his children could sleep in the barn loft, where the hay would at least keep the worst of the cold away. It was not kindness, she told herself. It was practicality. She simply could not have 2 dead children on her land come morning. It would draw questions she did not want to answer. The next morning, before she had even finished her coffee, she found Caleb already at work, and what she saw stopped her cold on the porch steps. The fence line that had been sagging and broken since Thomas's death, the one she had not had the strength or the money to repair, was already half mended, the posts driven deep and true, the wire pulled taut in a way that spoke of a man who had done this work 1,000 times before and took pride in doing it right. He did not stop to explain himself or to ask for praise. He simply kept working, his breath fogging in the cold air, his hands raw and cracked, while his son fetched tools and his daughter sat wrapped in a blanket on a hay bale, watching her father with the kind of quiet trust that only a child who has lost everything else can still give. Over the following days, the ranch began to change in small but undeniable ways. The barn roof, which had been leaking since autumn and threatening to collapse under the weight of snow, was patched with scavenged wood and tar that Caleb somehow produced from nowhere, trading his own labor in the nearby town for materials Eleanor could not afford. The well pump, which had been groaning and sputtering for a year, was disassembled, cleaned, and reassembled in an afternoon, and clean water flowed easier than it had since Thomas died. Caleb did not ask for payment beyond the milk for his children and the meager meals Eleanor found herself, almost against her own will, setting an extra place for at her table. He ate less than his portion every time, always making sure his children and hers had enough first, and Eleanor noticed this, the way a person notices small kindnesses when they have forgotten kindness existed at all. Still, she kept her distance. She told herself this arrangement was temporary, a transaction born of desperation on both sides, nothing more. She watched him carefully for the cruelty she was certain must be hiding beneath the calluses and the quiet manners, because in her experience, men did not work this hard without wanting something in return that a woman would regret giving. But the weeks passed, and the cruelty never came. What came instead was a barn free of leaks, a fence that could hold cattle through the worst storm, a well that ran clear, and 2 children, hers and his, who had started playing together in the frost-covered yard, laughing in a way that Eleanor's household had not heard since the funeral. The real test came in the second week of the true winter, when the worst blizzard in a decade rolled down from the northern ridge and buried Larkspur Hollow under nearly 3 feet of snow in a single night. Eleanor woke to howling wind and a silence from the barn that terrified her more than any storm, because it meant her cattle, the last real asset standing between her family and losing the ranch entirely, might already be buried or worse. She fought her way through the drifts in the gray half-light of dawn, certain she would find disaster waiting, and instead found Caleb already there, having been awake since before the storm broke, working alone in the freezing dark to move the herd into the deepest part of the barn, packing straw against the walls with his bare, bleeding hands to keep the cold from finding its way through the gaps, holding a lantern in his teeth because he needed both hands free and would not stop even to warm himself. He had saved every single animal. Not one had been lost. And when Eleanor found him, exhausted, frostbitten at the fingertips, sitting in the hay with his own 2 children curled against him for warmth because he refused to let anyone else stand watch in the cold that night, something in her finally broke, not from fear this time, but from a grief and gratitude so tangled together she could not tell where one ended and the other began. She sat down beside him in the hay that morning, and for the first time since Thomas had died, she found herself telling a living soul about the nights she lay awake wondering if she had made the right choice staying on this land instead of selling it and taking her children somewhere safer, about the shame she felt every time she could not make ends meet, about the fear that she was failing her children in the exact way she had promised Thomas, on his deathbed, that she never would. Caleb did not offer easy comfort or empty promises. He simply listened, the way a man listens who has carried his own losses long enough to know that most grief does not want to be fixed, only witnessed. He told her about his wife, about the fever that had taken her in a wagon camp with no doctor for 50 miles, about the guilt that had followed him every mile since, the certainty that he should have found some way to save her, and about how the only thing that had kept him moving forward at all was the 2 small faces that still needed him to be strong even when he did not feel strong at all. By the time the snow finally melted into the first thaw of the season, the Voss Ranch was no longer the failing, half-collapsed property that everyone in town whispered would not survive another year. The fences held. The barn stood solid against the wind. The herd had not just survived, but had grown healthier under Caleb's steady care, and word had begun to spread through Larkspur Hollow that Eleanor Voss's ranch, once given up for lost, was somehow thriving again. Neighbors who had crossed the road to avoid the widow's misfortune now stopped to ask after her health and, more quietly, to ask after the quiet stranger who had turned things around. Eleanor found herself defending Caleb's character before anyone even accused him of anything, and she realized with a start one afternoon, watching him teach her son how to mend a harness while her daughter and his daughter chased each other around the yard, that she was no longer simply tolerating his presence. She had come to depend on it, and worse, or perhaps better, she had come to want it there. It was not a swift or dramatic courtship, because 2 people who had both buried a spouse and carried children through hardship did not fall into new love carelessly. It grew the way the mended fence had grown, post by post, through small acts that meant more than any grand declaration could have. The way Caleb always made certain Eleanor's children had the warmest spot by the fire before he sat down himself. The way Eleanor began leaving an extra blanket folded on the loft ladder without being asked. The way both of their children had, without any adult decision being made at all, simply started calling the ranch home instead of Miss Eleanor's place, or Caleb's stopping point. One evening in early spring, as the first green was beginning to push up through the mud along the fence line Caleb had built with his own bleeding hands, Eleanor stood on the porch and watched him walk in from the fields with his children running ahead of him toward the house. And she understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that this ranch was no longer merely surviving. It was becoming a family's home again, built not from what winter had taken from either of them, but from what two broken, wary, grieving people had chosen to give each other when they had every reason to keep their hearts locked away. If this story has touched something in your heart the way it touched ours while we told it, we would be so grateful if you took just a moment to like this video and share it with someone who might need a reminder that kindness still exists, that second chances are real, and that sometimes the hardest winters bring us exactly the people we need most. Before you go, please leave a comment below and tell us, do you believe a stranger's kindness can truly save a family the way it saved Eleanor and Caleb's? We read every single one, and your words mean more to this channel than you know. By the following winter, when the first snow finally fell on Larkspur Hollow again, it fell on a ranch with a solid roof, a full barn, and a family gathered warm around one table. No longer two broken households clinging to survival, but one family bound together by everything winter had tried to take and everything love had refused to let go of.